Welcome Home, a podcast for veterans, about veterans by veterans, is a project of Willing Warriors and the Warrior Retreat at Bull Run.
Good morning. I'm your host, Larry Ziliaks, Director of Culinary Services here at the Warrior Retreat at Bull Run. And this week, our guest is Bob Bauer. He is the founder of the Sergeant Robert Bauer Warriors Foundation. He's a trauma recovery and mental health coach, and I really wanted to get him on to talk about the services that the organization provides and just ways in which veterans can find resources and help for mental health issues. So, Bob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So if you would, just tell us a little bit about your background and what kind of led you to forming this organization.
Well, in 2014, I retired from a career in law enforcement. I'd spent over 4 decades in law enforcement. Prior to entering law enforcement, I had been in the military. I'd been in the Air Force for a couple of years, and then I was in the Army for about 10 years. When I retired from law enforcement, I became a college professor. And one day I was standing before my class. I had 60 kids in this particular class. And I had a vision of these kids 20 years down the road. Some of them they looked like they were beat up and haggard. Some of them were missing. Some of them looked traumatized. And I remember kind of saying a prayer. It's like, God, what does this mean? And I felt like I was seeing the future because it was also my past, because I saw military personnel and first responders become victims to trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the culture in both of those communities, nobody seeks help. Mm. And they just go deeper into the ditch to the point where they end up taking their lives. So I felt a calling to start an organization that would reach out to those communities, those 2 communities, to include their families. And we began to address the mental health aspects of it, working with the Veterans Affairs, group, and working with, law enforcement groups like Fraternal Order of Police in the area, so on and so forth. And so we began to reach out to that community. My background is I have a graduate level degree in counseling and in psychology. And recently, I just passed the board. I'm a board certified mental health coach and counselor. I've been referred to as a trauma specialist. So that's how it kind of got me into it, is being a college professor and looking at 18, 19-year-old kids in a classroom and having that vision of what it could be like 20 years down the road. Now, the one thing about it is that was in 2014. I taught for 3 years. I work with a lot of those people who are police officers now,
mm-hmm.
reaching out to me because they're hitting a wall and they know they can talk to me. They know that I'm not going to label them. They know that, we work to go forward. We're not looking at the past. The first experience I can tell you that I had as a young man was working for the Hagerstown police department. He called me at 3:00 in the morning. He had been a police officer for 3 weeks. He called me at 3:00 in the morning. He told me, he says, I really need to talk to you. He says, I worked my first fatality car accident tonight. He said it was an 18-month-old baby. He was traumatized. Here he had a 22-year-old kid,
mm-hmm.
Had never experienced that before. And those are the kind of things we deal with. I even interact with Vietnam veterans who are still dealing with moral injury from Vietnam.
Sure.
And so we work with them in the sense of addressing what they're dealing with, and then from there we move forward. We also sponsor a course called Reboot Recovery. Well, we've partnered with Reboot Recovery, which is out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The founder, she's a physical therapist out there. So they started offering 12-week courses that address trauma. And they have a course specifically for first responders, a course specifically for military, and then one's kind of like carte blanche that covers everybody, which was fantastic during COVID because everybody was traumatized. And we got kicked offline, so to speak, when COVID came along. We could no longer meet face-to-face. So we've been meeting virtually. We've been doing courses 5 a year. virtually. They're 12-week courses. And what we do is we walk them through trauma to understand what they're dealing with. First of all, we identify what trauma is. A lot of people we encounter think you've got to be in the military, you've got to be a first responder, you have to be a sexual assault victim, somebody, who's really faced something in order to say, I've been traumatized. We educate them as to what trauma is. And then we walk them through the different steps over a 12-week period of what is grief. What do we do to avoid grief? What is shame, guilt, and regret? Mm-hmm. What is forgiveness? So we walk them through that. And it's a 12-week program, but it's also a program about building community. I'm a real advocate about building community, that you can walk through life alone, or you can walk through life with a battle buddy or a battle community. So that's kind of what we do.
Mm-hmm. And so the organization, I'm assuming you have a web page.
Yeah,
right?
It's GISMR, which basically stands for God is my rock.
Okay.
.org.
So veterans go there, or first responders, and is there a way for them to use I'm sure you have a number of resources, but a way for them to contact you or reach out to you?
Yes, they can reach out through the website. There's an area there where they can contact us. It has our contact information with regards to the website. The website basically contact is sergeantb@gismr.org or info@gismr.org. They can call us. We're in the Washington, D.C. metro area right now. Mm-hmm. As of January 2025, we're expanding out to the West Virginia, Maryland area. We're going to be working with Veterans Affairs Hospital out in Martinsburg. Mm-hmm. So we'll be, expanding the program out there. We'll be doing a first responder and a military reboot course, and we've partnered with several therapists out there to work with us. Other than Veterans Affairs, there may be some senior veterans who don't trust the Veterans Organization, so we've partnered with several therapists, psychotherapists, or whatever, to work with them.
Mm-hmm. So there's no requirement for them to be in the VA system?
No.
Okay, so no disability rating or anything?
Oh, absolutely not. And that's one thing we don't do. We don't label you. A lot of people don't want to be labeled. It's like I tell people, in 1994, I was diagnosed with PTSD. At first, I was elated because I could understand why I was having the problems I was having. Mm-hmm. But later on down the road, that label can affect you. In society, they think you're a Rambo, gone off the ledge. So we don't label anybody. I mean, we can identify what challenges they're facing, and then we put together a plan. Mm-hmm. Okay, how do we move forward? Mm-hmm. It's like you can be stuck in the mud in your car, and then you get out. You're not always going to continue looking back at the mud hole. You want to know how to proceed forward, so that's what we do.
Mm-hmm. When you have somebody come to you mm-hmm. who has a combination of issues, and, our listeners are very familiar with the idea that you rarely see a veteran or first responder who has just one issue, that mm-hmm. just has PTS or has moral injury. It's just usually TBI, PTS, moral injury, and they're starting to isolate, and they're self-medicating with alcohol and drugs. So a veteran is referred to you. Their family is pushing them to get help. And what does a typical course of therapy look like for somebody who comes to you that needs some help?
Well, kind of like what we're doing. The first thing we do is we sit down and have a conversation because we want to establish a relationship. So we initially tell them, we're not here to label you. We're not here to judge you. I share a little bit of my story with them so they understand I'm familiar with their journey. Mm-hmm. Okay, I've been down that path. I know where the landmines are at, so I'm trying to help navigate. I'm kind of like a compass. I'm trying to help you navigate through it. And then I sit and I ask questions. I go all the way back to childhood. Mm-hmm. What was your family life like? What was your relationship like with your parents? Your grandparents, your aunt and uncles? Because a lot of times we bring childhood trauma into our adulthood and we don't recognize it. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. Both of my parents were children of alcoholics. Mm-hmm. My dad's parents were narcissistic alcoholics. My mom's father, who was the alcoholic, and my grandmother had the secondary effect of alcoholism. She didn't drink, but she had the personality of an alcoholic. My parents grew up in this environment. My father was a Marine. He fought in Korea. He was seriously injured. He watched his entire squad wiped out. He was up at Chosun Reservoir, almost lost his life. When he was a kid, he was an outgoing kid. But when he returned from Korea, he became an introvert.
Mm-hmm.
My father hated conflict.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, my mom loved it and oftentimes would stir it up. So my childhood was a challenge in the sense that I didn't have a good relationship with either one of my parents. Like I said, my father was an introvert. He was withdrawn. My mother was nasty. But it was years later when I went and got educated, I learned that both of their actions as adults and as parents were a result of their childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to break that intergenerational cycle. So I share that story with the people I'm interacting with, going, this is where I come from. And they begin to look back at theirs. And so then what we do is we ask, okay, what's your relationships like now? If you're married, what are they like with your spouse? What is it like with your children? What's it like at work? Because as you said, oftentimes what happens is those moral wounds will take over.
Mm-hmm.
And you, the first thing, there's 4 roadblocks in order to identify the fact that you have moral wounds. One, the first thing we do is we deny it. I'm cool. I don't have any problems, or I can handle it.
Mm-hmm.
We lie to ourselves. And then pretty soon the stress becomes so overwhelming, our emotions take over. We get angry. Sometimes we get violent,
Mm-hmm.
Where domestic violence comes in, or, we withdraw. So then we basically try to mask our pain. And we do that. Basically, we're trying to get our endorphins to fire up, to have a feel-good moment. And we start doing stupid things, drinking, drugs, illicit sex, gambling, dangerous behavior,
Mm-hmm.
all those things. It's not because we enjoy doing it. It's because it gives us a buzz. It makes us feel good.
Mm-hmm.
And then we reach a level to where we can't do anything to mask the pain. I mean, you peak out.
Yeah.
And then that's when we run away. Running away can mean that you disengage with society, or it could mean that you commit suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Or as they say now, you make yourself unalive. But the thing about it is so when we sit down and we talk to somebody, we explain to them those 4 roadblocks,
Mm-hmm.
And ask them, do you recognize any of them? And automatically they start ticking off. Yeah. They go, you got to understand in the military, or even law enforcement, you can't identify that you're hurting
Mm-hmm.
because you're part of a community that will kick you out.
Mm-hmm.
They will evict you. And so you don't want to lose your identity. I mean, think about a cop. A cop goes through 6 months of academy, police academy. I mean, and they face challenge after challenge. I mean, physical challenges, mental challenges, spiritual challenges while they're going through that academy. And then now they're part of a community. So then now they're a cop. They're on the street. They've been there 5 years. They've seen all kinds of things, and they can't sleep at night. They start getting angry. They got issues. In fact, the statistics, well, not official statistics, but unofficial statistics say that a police officer that spends 20 years in law enforcement will probably experience 3 different marriages because they can't deal with it. Because number one, you don't want to come home and tell your wife that you're battling these issues
Mm-hmm.
because 1, she might judge you, or 2, she might just totally disengage. So rather than take that chance, you just bottle it up, you bury it inside of you. When I talk to military, I use the example of the rucksack. When you have a problem that you can't deal with, you just throw that brick in your rucksack.
Mm-hmm.
Just keep throwing it. I mean, it started off, with a 100-pound rucksack already, but now you're loading it up with things you don't want to face. You're avoiding it. And so, we walk them through that to let them know, the different things that they're doing that might keep them from getting the help that they need. We talk about grieving. What are the areas of grieving that you're experiencing? Because some people think that, at least in the military, you lose a friend, in a combat situation, you're supposed to get over it right away.
Mm-hmm.
You just compartmentalize it. And that's what military personnel are taught. You compartmentalize it. I remember when I was in active Army, I was in the infantry, and I remember I had a sergeant tell me one time, he goes, just put it away. He says, you shouldn't have any friends. He said, because they don't live long enough for you to have a friend. But there again, you go through basic training with them, you go through AIT with them, you build a community, a friendship, a family. You depend on them, and now you lose them. So we address that. We tell the people that we're interacting with, number one, what you're dealing with, absolutely normal. How you're dealing with it is not normal. And so, as I said, I look forward. I don't look backwards. So it's like, okay, we understand now what you're dealing with. Are you ready to travel forward? And then we create a plan. It's like if they don't have a good relationship with their spouse, we work with them to find a counselor to basically interact with them, to establish communication, between the two. And the same thing with children. I mean, it's really bad when you have a marriage that's falling apart and then you have a teenager who's not quite sure who they are. It's a mess. And so we help them find those resources. We partner with churches that can help them with that. The VA offers some of that. But what we do is we want to establish communication. But the other key thing is we want to establish community. There's 3 key things that every human being needs. One, they need to trust, and the only way you can trust somebody is if you're vulnerable. Both of you are vulnerable. The other thing is socialization. We want to be part of something, and then there's community, something bigger than us. Where you can turn to. So those are 3 key factors. And what we do, we try to establish. One, trust. Like I said, when I sit down and talk with somebody, I share my story. I want to be vulnerable. It's like, I've been there. Okay. I've done that. I can help you climb out of the ditch. And there's a story that I share, and I don't want to belabor it too long, but it's about a kid who was struggling, and he, in the denial phase, I'm good. I don't need help. And then one morning he woke up and he found himself deep in a hole, and he didn't know how to get out of the hole. So he starts screaming, help me. I need help. And this really nice Wall Street looking guy comes walking by and, sees him and hears him, walks over, says, what can I do for you? And he says, look, I'm losing my life. I need your help. I need to get out of this hole. I'm angry all the time. I'm yelling at my wife and my kids. I'm about to lose my marriage. I'm fighting with coworkers. So I'm about to lose my job. I can't sleep at night. I can't eat. I feel like I'm losing my life. And so the businessman walks away for a minute, and then he comes back and hands him a shovel and a bucket. He said, you're a talented young man. You can dig yourself out of this hole. So he hands him that. And the kid really bought into the pumping up, the pep talk. And so he's trying to dig himself out of the hole to only realize that he's going deeper. So now he's completely discouraged, and he's sitting on the bucket. And then he hears some familiar voices, and he stands on top of the bucket and he starts screaming, help me, help me. It was his family and his friends. And he's going, yes, these people will help me. So they came over, he explained to them what he was dealing with, and they stepped away. They conversed amongst each other, and they go, have you talked to the professionals? He goes, yeah, all they did is give me a shovel and a bucket. They said, well, that's what you need to do. And they walked away. Well, then he's totally discouraged at this point, and he's sitting on top of the bucket again. He hears some more he hears some more voices, and he stands on the bucket and looks out. He's not enthusiastic about screaming for help. And he sees a group of people, and he goes, hey, can you help me? Almost in a defeated tone. And the people came over, and they turned out to be the medical profession. And he explains to them what he's dealing with, and the medical profession goes, well, we can't make a decision now. We have to evaluate you. And so they did an evaluation, and they came back and they go, well, we can't solve your problem, but we can help you. And he handed them a bag of medicine and said, here, this will help you. And he goes, well, what happens if they run out? Oh, they'll never run out. We have an unlimited supply. And the thing about it is he took a couple pills, and he felt completely empty. He felt numb, and he realized that he didn't have a life anymore. So he decided he was going to end it. So now he's sitting on the bucket, and he's thinking about ending his life. He has the pills and stuff. Then all of a sudden he hears some whistling in the background, which really annoyed him because he was miserable. How can anybody be so happy when I'm just lousy? And so he stands on the bucket to see who it is, and he sees an old guy walking along whistling, and he screams at him. He goes, stop that whistling. And so the guy comes over and says, how you doing? All happy and everything. He goes, why are you so happy? He goes, why shouldn't I be? He says, I'm alive. And the kid goes, I'm miserable. And the old guy goes, well, why? He says, if you really want to know, I'll tell you. So he sat down and shared the whole story. And the kid dropped his head in complete defeat. And all of a sudden he hears a thud. And he looks up and the old man is face to face with him. And so he starts screaming at the old man. He goes, what are you doing in there, old man? You know what? I don't know how to get out of here. Now we're both stuck. And the old guy looked at him and said, I've been in this hole before. Follow me. And that's kind of like the image of our organization. When we interact with somebody, we've been in that hole. Mm-hmm. And so we want to help them get out of the hole. We want to help them get on a path that will lead them to a fulfilling life. You know, it's not going to be peaches and cream. We tell them up front, life's a challenge, but we'll give you the resources in order to be able to go. In fact, we often say we act as a compass for those navigating through the traumatic minefields to find that path that will lead to a fulfilling life. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what we do.
Is there a marked difference between the veterans that you see and who are suffering from military service and law enforcement or first responders? Is it virtually the same, or is there some real stark differences?
Well, active duty personnel and first responders have a similar mindset. Okay, first of all, they want to stay in the community. Mm-hmm. Okay, their community. In the law enforcement community, they call it the sheepdog. You know, they identify as being a sheepdog. This is something that Colonel David Grossman created a few years back as an image. It was basically something to identify with to move forward. And active military, the same thing. You're in a community. You have a brotherhood, sisterhood. You have a family. You don't want to get kicked out of that. Mm-hmm. However, veterans are no longer in that community. And the same thing with retired first responders. It's kind of like you have COVID. The minute you retire, everybody forgets you. Mm. I know in the law enforcement community, you know, when I retired, prior to when I retired, I knew a lot of people in the business. You know, I've been retired now going on 11 years. I couldn't tell you who's in my old agency. Mm. They're all, you know, it's like I often say, what are you recruiting these people from the Boy Scout Explorers? So they're so young. But the thing about it is that you feel disengaged. On one aspect, you don't want to be kicked out of the community. The other one, you no longer have a community. And so it's a matter of trust. Now, there's a lot of law enforcement agencies, larger law enforcement agencies, that are creating programs that will address trauma. I can tell you Fairfax County, Virginia, Chief Davis has instilled a program where if you face a trauma, immediately you go talk to a counselor. Mm-hmm. You know, evaluate where's your mindset. And of course, every cop, especially a young one, says, I'm good, I have no problems, but they never come back. In Washington, D.C., when Chief Charles Ramsey was the chief, he created a program where they have a psychology unit that's completely separate and apart from the police department, but it's a free service for law enforcement officers. Mm. Where they can go over, they talk to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Nothing's made available to the city. Philadelphia has a similar program. When Chief Ramsey left D.C., he went and became the commissioner in Philly, and he's created the same program there. Those are the things that law enforcement officers need. They need to have trust. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the thing that we work with. We work with these other organizations, too, in the area where it's about establishing trust, that vulnerability, as I was saying before. It's about community. Because isolation kills. Mm-hmm. You know, there's shame, guilt, and regret. You know, the three ugly sisters is what I call them. You know, guilt tells you you did something wrong. Shame tells you you are wrong. So the thing is we try to emphasize guilt is just a conviction. It says, look, you made a mistake, you can correct it, move on. Shame wants you to live in the ditch, wants you to give up. So we address that. We build the trust in that regards in order to move forward. Now, is that easy? No, especially when you go back to childhood. If you get information, the childhood traumas there, you know, they've never had any trust. And so you have to almost address that from way back. You know, who do I trust? What kind of traumas have they faced growing up? Okay, were they abused in school? Were they abused at church? You know, were they abused, you know, by the babysitter or whatever? So it's kind of like, you have to figure out where the wound's at in order to move forward.
You know, one of the things that's always struck me about the military is that so many over the years, so many service members joined the military to escape.
Mm-hmm.
But yet the military really never recognized that they had recruits who had generational trauma because they have always had this mindset that it doesn't matter who comes to us to join. We're going to instill our behavior and our way of life in them, and whatever happened to them before will go away. And that's just so wrong.
It is.
And it's just, and you'd think they'd recognize that, because within that first 3 years is when so many enlisted soldiers have problems, whether it's disciplinary, drug and alcohol problems, or suicide. I mean, the rate of suicide for active duty members is much higher in those first years because of that generational trauma that's just not addressed. Just hope someday that the services, the branches begin to recognize that and maybe either not accept everybody who comes to the front door or finds a way to examine people and offer help than just to say, okay, we'll just fix them and they'll be fine once they go through our basic training. When we talk about suicide amongst veterans, today, depending on the source of the information, whether it's the VA, which is, around 17 per day, as their latest count. And then you look at the Operation Deep Dive report, which puts it at about 24. It's just so high. And it just seems like it's just a problem that nobody can find an answer for. And I really am curious about what your thoughts are as to how, as a community, whether it's military, veteran community, or just community at large, because, somewhere around 158 to 160 people, Americans just take their own life every day. A large percentage of that are veterans, unfortunately, but it is a problem that the community at large faces. What's your thoughts about some of the ways that we might be able to address that?
Well, let me go back and address something you said earlier about people coming in the military with a lot of baggage. Now, if you remember back in the 1950s and 1960s, a lot of people were going into the military as a result of a court order. So they already had baggage, going in. So the question is, why were you a juvenile delinquent? And that's when the questions should have started. Mm-hmm. Why are you like this? And that's why we go back and we ask those initial questions. We want to know, it's kind of like when you plant a seed in the garden, you want to know that the ground is fertile, you want to know that the seed, is good seed and you nurture it when it's growing up. But if you just throw seeds wherever, it's hard telling what you're going to get. So that's the big challenge. People come into the military, like you said, to run away from something. Mm-hmm. So the big challenge with us is when it comes to suicide, the misnomer is people think suicide is a cop-out. They're a coward. They can't face it. And I've heard that time and time again. Mm. And the example that I use when I explain what suicide is, you go back to 9/11, the 2 planes hit the towers, and we're all fixated on the TV, and we're watching people jump from the towers. Mm-hmm. Now, were they jumping because their life was in a disarray? Were they jumping because they thought they could escape? No, they had fire behind them. They didn't want to experience the pain. And that's what suicide is. These people are exhausted. Mm-hmm. They are walking wounded. I mean, we herald people in combat that have been, had multiple shots fired at them, and they continue to engage in the battle. And we herald them. I mean, we give them medals and awards. But like with a cop who's dealing with all kinds of wounds, say he had childhood trauma and he became a cop because he wanted to save the next generational kid, mm-hmm. From that trauma, from the alcoholic father, the drug addict mom, the abusive parents. He's still carrying that luggage from childhood and he's never addressed it. He figures, okay, I'm going to basically bandage my wound by becoming a cop. Mm-hmm. Now he's been a cop for some time. He sees all kinds of stuff. He realizes he's not going to change anything, but yet he doesn't have anybody to talk to. He's afraid to talk to his boss. He's afraid to talk to his friends. He's afraid to talk to his family because he's fearful he's going to get kicked out of the community.
Mm-hmm.
He or she is exhausted now. And out of exhaustion, they just want to end the pain.
Mm-hmm.
They just want to end the pain. And so, as I oftenly refer to it, they cross the final bridge into eternity,
mm-hmm.
At their own hands. They're in pain. And I can tell you there's many times I've talked with people who are on the edge of that bridge. And I will say to them, I'm here to listen. I'm not here to judge. I'm not here to give you any advice. I just want to listen. And that's what most people want when they are dealing with moral wounds. They want somebody to listen. I have this rule with people that I interact with. You can call me at any time of the day. If you're calling to vent, you need to tell me up front. I just want to vent. So my role is not to say a word, just to listen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm a guy. If you came to me with a problem, I want to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll tell that to my wife too. If you just want to complain, tell me I'm venting. Because then that way I'm not going to take it personal and I'm not going to try and fix it. So, but that's what I do with everybody I interact with. And I get a lot of calls from people, that go, I just want to vent because nobody's listening.
Mm-hmm.
And once they get it out, they feel better. And then if they want to talk about what's next steps, we do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have heard that people say that suicide is a cop-out, which is remarkable because if you ever talk to somebody who attempted suicide or really seriously thought about it, they will tell you right up, it's all about the pain.
Exactly.
That they were just looking for a way to make it stop. And that, I think, is the key. If you can offer something to that person to help them manage and take away the pain, that's really the whole purpose of it, is to put a pause in that action for long enough to get an understanding of the help that they need and then direct them to the resource, which clearly is your organization. Give us that webpage again.
Okay, it's www.gismr.godismyrock.org.
Okay. And I'm assuming there's a spot on there that they can press a button and donate.
Yeah, at the end of the page, they can do that. But let me address something real quick before we cut off. When we're talking about suicide, one of the things I share with the people I interact with is I attempted suicide once. And I was homeless for 11 months one time, living on the streets of Charlotte. What precipitated all this for me was I got out of the military because my father, who was 48 at the time, was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. Prior to that, my marriage to my high school sweetheart had ended because she found somebody else. And, that's a whole nother story. So anyhow, over a 2-year period of time, I had lost friends in the military. My marriage ended, and now my father was dying of cancer. I felt totally helpless. I got off of active duty on a hardship discharge to come home and help my mom. I became a deputy sheriff. And I got involved with another woman, as I call it. It was a perfect storm waiting to happen. Something happened with that relationship that I said, I'm done. I went and turned in all my gear to the sheriff's department. I resigned and I left town. I jumped on an airplane and I flew to Charlotte, North Carolina, where I didn't have a job. I didn't have money. I didn't have a place to live. But for 11 months, I lived on the street. Now, granted, I had some really cheesy jobs. I worked at a nursing home washing dishes, and I worked there simply because I knew I could get a free meal. I can tell you when you get old, though, people don't season food. So it was a bad place to eat, and they would let me do my laundry there. And then on weekends, I drove this scrap truck where I made money doing that as well. So I wasn't basically panhandling. I was making my own money. But I got to the point where I was hurting and I had nobody to talk to. And I remember I went to a clinic, complained to them that my back was hurting. So they gave me this whole prescription of muscle relaxers. And one night, sitting in the park that I was staying at, I popped them all. And as I tell everybody, I remember feeling my body shut down. I was in absolute pain. I just didn't want to go on anymore because I was disengaged from everybody, my family, my friends. Mm-hmm. I was living in Charlotte. I really didn't know anybody. And I could feel my body shutting down. I remember laying down on the ground. And as I laid there flashback. They say your life flashes before you. Well, for me, it did, because I saw the birth of my first daughter all over again as though I was there. I watched myself fishing with my father, which was great memories. And then the next thing I remember, somebody's yelling at me, big old light, over me, yelling at me, do you know who you are? Do you know where you're at? And I remember thinking to myself, you've died, you've gone to hell, and they don't have a clue who you are, And so then a couple days later, I woke up in this room in the hospital. The police officer had found me and drove me to the hospital. He didn't call an ambulance. Explained to me what had happened. And that's when I began to turn things around for me. I basically was able to finish school, college, went on to get a law degree. I have 2 graduate level degrees, and things like that. But the thing is I was exhausted. I was tired. Mm-hmm. So that's the one thing I share with people, when my vulnerability. Look, I know what it feels like. And so when it comes to us reaching out to people to help them, we truly want to help them get out of that ditch.
Yeah.
Or the old guy jumping in the ditch.
Sure.
When we reach out for help financially to fund the different projects we do, I'm completely vulnerable. This has nothing to do with me. I've been blessed over these years to basically be healed from my soul wounds. I basically, the Lord has blessed me with an organization that helps other people. I found purpose for my pain. Mm-hmm. And that's what I share with people when we're reaching out to help them or when we're reaching out for funding.
Well, when it comes to funding, there's no reason why listeners can't donate and hit that button and give what you can. This is an amazing organization that does incredible work helping veterans and first responders stay on course, manage their moral injury, their PTS, and, really help them avoid going into a spiral and seeing that the only way to end the pain is through suicide, which everything we can do to keep veterans and first responders from taking their own life is just something that we just can't avoid. We can't not do it. So please visit the webpage and hit that donate button and give what you can to support the amazing work that they do. Bob, thank you so much for sitting down with us and talking to us and letting our listeners know everything that you guys do.
Thank you for asking me. I could sit here and talk to you all day about this, but I really appreciate the invitation.
Yeah. For our listeners, we'll have another episode next Monday morning at 0500. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can reach us at podcast@willingwarriors.org. Until then, thanks for listening.
The Welcome Home podcast is brought to you by Willing Warriors, a nonprofit organization serving active duty service members and veterans since 2012. To learn more, please visit our webpage at willingwarriors.org.